This summer, Israeli consular officials arranged meetings with the dean at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in order to air grievances about a course being taught on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. According to new reporting from The Intercept, the Israeli officials took issue with the grad student teaching the course over her alleged anti-Semitic comments on Twitter. They were backed not only by pro-Israel websites, who had launched a concerted public pressure campaign to have the student removed from her position, but by a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Kathy Manning of North Carolina, who also met with the dean.
In the tweets in question, PhD student Kylie Broderick questions the two sides argument and argues that the rhetorical conflict is not that of two equal sides, but, quote, the oppressed and imperialist propaganda. But in the end, the Israeli officials were unsuccessful, and Broderick remains in her post. I guess they were coming at her by saying, because she was questioning whether or not it was truly a two sides argument. And they ultimately did not win that argument against her, which I find really interesting, because I feel like in years past, maybe that would have been a no-brainer. But now, as the conversations have shifted, it seems that the conversation has really opened up for everybody to kind of have this discussion more freely, I would think. And
I think they also took issue with, I'm curious for your take on this, Emily, I think they also took issue with her use of Zionist ideology, and saying that she did not believe in, that the Zionist ideology was supportive. What she has said in response is said, look, an ideology can be criticized. Mm-hmm. And criticizing an ideology is different than criticizing a people, and criticizing just as criticizing a government is different than criticizing a people. But when you see somebody criticize Zionist ideology, do you think that is kind of what set them off?
Yeah, I do think that's what set them off, and I think that to some extent that sensitivity is fully understandable, because I think the far left has lost its benefit of the doubt with a lot of Israelis and supporters of Israel, because there is a very real problem of anti-Semitism on the far left, the fringe left, the academic left. I think academia does actually have a problem with anti-Semitism, so I understand the level of sensitivity. I think it is ridiculous to exert international pressures on a university over a TA, making what I think is, I think it's an extreme argument. I don't like the argument, but I think it is absolutely absurd to exert pressures on the university over these tweets. Absurd.
And what's interesting is that they're inside of Israel itself. There are Israelis who actually criticize and denounce even the Zionist ideology. So this isn't really like I think a lot of people, when they think of criticizing Zionism, they think that they're criticizing the whole of Israel or all Jews, and that's just not the case. It's a specific ideology that not even all Israelis themselves hold, which is really interesting.
I think that's right, yeah. And one of my bugaboos about cancel culture has always been that the people who are actually most often the victims of actual cancel culture are anybody, particularly in an academic space, who is critical of the Israeli government. And you don't often see the right standing up to that. Why do you think that is? I mean, you're an exception to this, but why do you think that there is this kind of Israeli exception to the cancel culture outrage?
I mean, I think it is because of what I was talking about earlier, that there is, and I think it's wrong, of course, but I think there's this heightened level of sensitivity. I actually wrote a piece a couple of months ago talking about how there are people on both the left and the right who actually really do think cancel culture, sort of intellectually, they buy into the philosophy of cancel culture, which is, that basically there are reasons that people should be canceled at a higher clip, at a higher rate, at a bigger scale than when we do. We should have narrower boundaries for speech, et cetera, et cetera. And I think those people should be open about it. But instead, I think there is some hypocrisy on the right, where you have things like the professor watch list that came out at Turning Point USA that put a bunch of professors literally on a watch list so that people, I mean, listen, if you're at a public school, I think what you say should be subject to public criticism and everything, but it's a sort of chilling effect on free speech. But I do think that the root of it is because there is heightened sensitivity over the very real problems of people on the mainstream left. You can talk about Tamika Mallory. You can talk about people who have been associated with people like Louis Farrakhan. That's why the sensitivity is heightened on this issue, and probably why it's harder for people on the right to exercise some, let's say, reservation or hesitance when it comes to cancel culture on Israel issues.
And it seems, though, that this sort of debate even extends into the U.S. You know, when you talk about when there's any criticism of any sort of imperialism, you know, or saying, OK, this one particular group is coming in and they're kind of pushing out the natives. When there's ever any of that discussion, even in the United States, it's, oh, you're anti-American. Right, like you don't love America if you're going to criticize the U.S.'s past. And that also seems to extend over to Israel. If anyone criticizes and says, hey, what they're doing seems to be, you know, not exactly what we're told, or maybe it's, you know, maybe we could reframe this a bit. And then, you know, it seems to be you get that same sort of criticism. You're then anti-Semitic. Right. And I think Bari Weiss is actually a great example of this. She's not exactly on the right, but she's one of the loudest people who condemns the entire rubric of cancel culture. She's also one of the first people who's going to try to cancel a professor if they have the wrong views as far as she's concerned. And yeah, what she would say is, well, anti-Semitism is a very real thing. That is true. Anti-Semitism is a very real thing and needs to be combated. That is also true. But racism is a very real thing. And, you know, cancel culture, you know, builds itself on top of the idea that racism needs to be pushed back against, which of course it does. And so there's just no way for her to separate out her conflicting views here, and not just her, but anybody who believes in this exception for the state of Israel in this question. You either you got to be cancel culture or not. It kind of depends on how you define a dog whistle. So, like the Ilhan Omar example, which you actually have done reporting on, where she tweeted all about the Benjamins. It's a good example, right? You either see that clearly as a dog whistle for legitimate racism, and thus you would want to kind of have a legitimate reason to cancel somebody, a sitting member of Congress, or you say, well, let's hold off a minute, or, you know, the same thing with Zionism. If you see anti-Zionism as a dog whistle for legitimate racism, and people like Bari Weiss have good reason to have their radar up. I mean, she's literally from the Pittsburgh area where the Tree of Life shooting was. They have good reason to be sensitive about that. But I mean, I broadly agree with you. Yeah, and I think that people go too quickly to 11 to cancel. Because if you ask her about that situation, you know, she was like, I was talking about Kevin McCarthy. Like, I never thought Ilhan Omar says that. Yeah, Ilhan Omar was like, I was talking about Kevin McCarthy. He's not Jewish. I didn't think that anybody was going to think that what I was saying was anti-Semitic. And then when people in her life that she knows were like, no, this really set off alarm bells for people. She gave a heartfelt apology, which was like, oh, I didn't realize how this would be received. And that's one way that you can go about these situations and come out the other end with more understanding. Yeah, I mean, I think that gets there's a lot of also criticism of Rashida Tlaib and From the River to the Sea. There are certain things that are seen as dog whistles, and certain things, you know, that people will say they honestly there's a non-racist case for making those comments. And so it's a very tangled conversation that also tangles the sort of sides on cancel culture. And it's interesting, and I'm actually really glad we're talking about it. I think this was quite helpful. Yeah, and we can probably all agree, right, Kim, that we don't need foreign government officials meeting with our professors. Meeting with deans about who's going to teach a course. Right. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, there is definitely anti-Semitism out there. I've seen it myself, and you know, it is pretty. It's visceral. You know, the people that their reaction to some things, and it's really terrible. But we do need to have the ability to criticize a foreign government and what they're doing. We needed the ability to do that without being called, you know, a racist or something along those, or anti-Semitic, or we need to have that freedom. Yeah, well said, and we'll have to leave it there. We will have more Rising right after this.